Halloween is now just 2 days away, and while the excitement is building, medical experts warn parents early about some of the dangers that can arise during trick-or-treating. Staff at Cooley Dickinson Hospital advising trick-or-treaters to stick together in groups, especially with the parents present. They also say you should follow the light, meaning you should avoid houses that have their lights off or that you're unfamiliar with. As for costumes, be mindful not to choose anything that can be a fire hazard, like long, flowing skirts or capes that can ignite around candles of jack-o'-lantern flames. But as one doctor explained, you also need to make sure your costume is easily seen.
We do see people who sometimes will fall. Children will come in who sometimes unfortunately get hit by vehicles because it's dark outside and everyone's excited, everyone's running through the streets, and so it's important that a parent be with them or they use a safe mechanism to walk around the neighborhood, using sidewalks, having flashlights, and being visible to people around.
As for candy, be sure to check your child's goodies before giving it to them and keep sweets like chocolate away from where any pet might have access.